Think your job is soul-crushing? At least your boss isn't literally crushing souls to appease the sun god. Why your worst Monday still beats ancient employment. So, you're having a rough week. Maybe your coffee was cold, your commute sucked, and Karen from accounting passive-aggressively CC'd your manager on an email. Rough stuff. But here's some perspective. At least you weren't selected by lottery to have your still-beating heart ripped out so that the sun would rise tomorrow. That was a legitimate workplace hazard for millions of people, across multiple continents, for thousands of years. Human sacrifice wasn't some fringe activity practiced by a couple of weird death cults. It was mainstream. It was state-sponsored. In some places, it had better infrastructure than the postal system. It had dedicated professionals, quality control standards, and probably performance reviews. Today, we're diving into 5 civilizations that turned ritual killing into an art form, a science, and occasionally, a spectator sport. Spoiler alert, it gets worse before it gets. No, it just keeps getting worse. The Aztecs built an entire economy around blood. Let's start with the headliners. The Aztec Empire didn't just practice human sacrifice, they industrialized it. While medieval Europeans were burning the occasional witch, the Aztecs were running what historians can only describe as a religious slaughterhouse, with better accounting practices than most Fortune 500 companies. The logic was simple, if terrifying. The Aztecs believed the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, needed human blood to keep rising each morning. No sacrifices meant no sunrise, which meant everyone dies anyway. So, really, they were doing you a favor. You're welcome. At the dedication of the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan in 1487, records claim 80,400 people were sacrificed over 4 days. Now, some historians think this number was exaggerated by Spanish conquistadors, looking to justify their own atrocities. Fair point. But even conservative estimates put annual sacrifices around 20,000 people. That's roughly 55 people per day, every single day. The Aztecs had priests working in shifts. The process itself was grimly efficient. 4 priests would hold the victim down on a stone slab, while a 5th sliced open the chest with an obsidian blade and yanked out the heart. The heart got lifted to the sky, the body got tossed down the temple steps, and sometimes, the flesh got distributed to elite families for ceremonial consumption. Yes, there was ritualized cannibalism. The thighs were apparently considered the premium cuts. I'm not going to make a joke about that because, honestly, what is there to say? But here's the truly wild part. The Aztecs didn't primarily sacrifice prisoners of war. They fought wars specifically to capture people alive for sacrifice. This was called the Flower War, and it was less a conflict and more a violent recruitment drive. Killing an enemy on the battlefield was considered wasteful, even shameful. You wanted to bring them back breathing. A warrior's social status depended on how many captives he delivered to the priests. It was performance-based compensation, just with more screaming. The Tzompantli, or skull rack, at Templo Mayor, held over 100,000 skulls, arranged in neat rows. Spanish chronicler Andrés de Tapia reported counting 136,000 skulls in 1521. When archaeologists excavated the site in 2015, they found evidence suggesting those numbers weren't exaggerated. Each skull had holes drilled through the temples so they could be strung on wooden poles. Think of it as the world's most horrifying trophy case. Children weren't exempt. Sacrifices to Tlaloc, the rain god, specifically required kids because their tears were believed to bring rainfall. Priests ensured the children cried before death. Some were drowned, others weren't so lucky. Children with physical abnormalities were considered especially valuable offerings. If that sentence doesn't make you grateful to be alive in the 21st century, nothing will. The political function of all this bloodshed shouldn't be overlooked. The Aztec Empire ruled over dozens of tributary states who weren't exactly thrilled about their situation. The constant stream of sacrifices, drawn heavily from these subject populations, served as a brutal reminder of who was in charge. When Hernán Cortés showed up in 1519, he found eager allies among the people the Aztecs had been terrorizing for generations. The Tlaxcalans, in particular, were so fed up with providing sacrifice victims that they allied with literal foreign invaders. That's how badly they wanted out. The Incas perfected the art of the beautiful death. If the Aztecs were the factory farm of human sacrifice, the Incas were the artisanal boutique. fewer victims, higher production value, and a genuinely disturbing attention to aesthetic detail. The Inca practice of capacocha, which translates roughly to royal obligation, selected the most physically perfect children from across the empire. These weren't prisoners or criminals. They were the equivalent of winning a beauty pageant where the prize was getting left on a frozen mountain to die. The kids were chosen, sometimes years in advance, fed the best foods, dressed in the finest textiles, and treated as living embodiments of the divine. Then, when an emperor died, or a natural disaster struck, or the empire just needed some cosmic PR, they'd march these children hundreds of miles through the Andes to their final destination. The journey itself was part of the ritual. Kids from coastal regions would be walked to peaks over 20,000 feet in elevation, passing through Cusco so the emperor could personally bless them. Some of these treks lasted months. Imagine being a 6-year-old on the longest, most terrifying road trip of your life, knowing exactly how it ends. The children were given coca leaves and chicha, a fermented corn alcohol, presumably to make the final stage more bearable for everyone involved. The methods varied. Some were strangled, others were hit over the head. Many were simply drugged into unconsciousness and left to die of exposure in the freezing mountain air. The cold, dry climate at extreme altitudes preserved their bodies perfectly. When archaeologists discovered the Lulayaco children on an Argentine volcano in 1999, the 3 sacrificed kids still had blood in their veins, hair on their heads, and food in their stomachs. They'd been frozen for over 500 years, but looked disturbingly recent. Analysis of their hair revealed elevated coca and alcohol consumption in the months before death. They were basically kept sedated during their final journey. Efficient? Yes. Merciful? That depends on your definition. The Incas also practiced capacucha, a more general term for offering systems that included burying attendants alive with deceased rulers. When Emperor Huayna Capac died around 1527, reportedly over 1,000 servants and concubines were killed to accompany him to the afterlife. Apparently, royalty required an entourage even in death. Heaven was going to be fully staffed, whether the staff liked it or not. Carthage and the Tophet controversy. Now, let's talk about Carthage, where child sacrifice gets academically complicated. The Carthaginians, those Phoenician-descended traders who gave Rome its only existential crisis, maintained special burial grounds called tophets. These sites contained thousands of urns filled with cremated remains of infants and young children, alongside small animals. Ancient Greek and Roman writers, including Diodorus, Siculus, and Plutarch, described Carthaginians sacrificing their own children to the god Baal-Hamon, sometimes in massive bronze statues, where the kids would roll into fires below. The Greeks called this practice Molech, or Moloch worship, and they were appropriately horrified. Here's where it gets messy. Some modern scholars argue this was propaganda. The Romans hated Carthage with the passion of 1,000 suns, so maybe they exaggerated to make their enemies look barbaric. The tophets might just be cemeteries for children who died naturally, not sacrifice pits. Infant mortality was brutal in the ancient world, after all. But here's the problem with that theory. The bone evidence doesn't fully support it. Osteological studies of Tophet remains show a weirdly consistent age range, mostly children under 2 years old, with patterns that don't match natural infant mortality curves. If these were just regular cemeteries, you'd expect a more varied age distribution. You'd also expect more disease markers on the bones. Instead, what researchers found were healthy children who died suddenly and were cremated immediately. A 2014 study published in Antiquity examined over 300 Carthaginian urns and concluded that the evidence weights heavily in favor of the literary tradition describing infant sacrifice. The children weren't sick, they weren't stillborn, they were killed. Diodorus Siculus wrote that during the siege of Carthage in 310 BCE, the city's elite sacrificed 200 children from noble families to appease the gods. When that didn't work, another 300 citizens volunteered their kids. The city fell anyway. Baal-Hamon apparently had better offers elsewhere. The practice seems to have peaked during times of crisis, which is dark but historically consistent. When things got bad, you made bigger sacrifices. The Carthaginians weren't unique in this logic, they were just more organized about it. There's also the class element worth noting. Some evidence suggests that elite families could substitute purchased or lower-class children for their own offspring. The gods demanded children, apparently, but they weren't picky about whose children specifically. Wealthy Carthaginians may have been outsourcing their religious obligations to the poor, which would make this one of history's earliest examples of the rich paying to avoid unpleasant duties. Some things never change. Shang dynasty China kept excellent records of killing people. The Shang dynasty ruled northern China from roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE, and they left behind one of history's creepiest paper trails, oracle bones. These were turtle shells and animal bones used for divination, inscribed with questions to ancestral spirits, and then heated until they cracked. The cracks were interpreted as answers. It's basically magic 8-ball technology for Bronze Age royalty. What makes these bones relevant to our topic is what the questions reveal. Shang kings regularly asked the spirits how many people they should sacrifice at upcoming ceremonies. Should we offer 30 men? Is 50 prisoners sufficient? The bones record everything, including the totals. Archaeologists have found inscriptions documenting sacrifices numbering in the hundreds for single events. The royal tombs at Yingshu, the Shang capital near modern Anyang, provide physical evidence to match the texts. Tomb excavations revealed pits containing headless skeletons, sometimes dozens at a time, arranged in neat rows. Some pits held only heads. Others contained bound skeletons with evidence of decapitation. These weren't battle casualties dumped in a mass grave, they were organized executions. The largest Shang royal tomb discovered, belonging to Lady Fu Hao around 1200 BCE, contained 16 human sacrifices. She was a queen and military general, so maybe 16 was considered modest for someone of her status. The tomb of her husband likely contained significantly more, though that site has been heavily looted over the centuries. Sacrifice victims fell into categories. Some were prisoners of war, particularly from the Qiang people to the west, who appear so frequently in oracle bone inscriptions that historians believe the Shang specifically rated them for sacrificial purposes. Others were slaves. Some, disturbingly, were Shang people themselves, chosen for reasons the bones don't fully explain. Building foundations also demanded blood. Before constructing a significant structure, the Shang buried sacrificial victims underneath. Human bones have been found beneath palaces, temples, and city gates. Dogs were sometimes substituted for people at less important sites, which I guess counts as progress? The logic was that spirits needed appeasement before construction could safely proceed. OSHA would have opinions about this. The sheer bureaucratic precision is what stands out. The Shang weren't sacrificing people in frenzied rituals. They were scheduling appointments with death, documenting outcomes, and filing reports. It was murder, but it was organized murder, with excellent record-keeping. Mesopotamia's royal tombs of started it all. We've saved the oldest for last. Around 2600 BCE, the Sumerian city of in modern-day Iraq, was burying its royalty with full entourages, and by full entourages, I mean dozens of people who were very much alive when the funeral started. British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated Ur's royal cemetery in the 1922nd and 1932nd, uncovering 16 royal tombs containing mass human remains. The most famous, the Great Death Pit, held 74 bodies, mostly women, arranged in orderly rows. They wore elaborate headdresses, gold jewelry, and colorful ribbons. They weren't dumped in carelessly, they were posed. Woolley's interpretation, which held for decades, was that these attendants willingly drank poison to follow their ruler into the afterlife. It was a romantic notion. Loyal servants choosing death out of devotion. Subsequent analysis complicated this narrative. CT scans of the skulls revealed evidence of blunt force trauma. Some of these people were hit in the head, hard, possibly after being drugged but before they died. Whether the blow was the coup de grace for an already dying person or the actual cause of death remains debated. Either way, willing starts to look questionable. The tomb of Queen Puabi contained 52 attendants, including soldiers in copper helmets and female attendants with elaborate jewelry. One attendant, positioned near the queen, wore a headdress so heavy it would have been impossible to put on herself. Someone dressed her for the occasion. Then she died wearing it. Forever. The retainer sacrifices at weren't random servants grabbed off the street. Analysis suggests they were trained specialists. Musicians with their instruments, guards with their weapons, attendants with their serving tools. These were skilled professionals who had spent years in royal service, and were expected to continue that service indefinitely. Your job following you into the grave wasn't a metaphor, it was policy. What's particularly striking about is that this practice appears fully developed in the earliest royal tombs we've found. There's no archaeological evidence of it slowly evolving from smaller-scale sacrifices. It just appears, elaborate and horrifying, right from the start. Either earlier evidence hasn't survived, or someone had a very bad idea very quickly, and everyone just went with it. Recent excavations at other Mesopotamian sites, including el Mara in Syria, have revealed similar patterns of elite burial with multiple attendants. This suggests wasn't an anomaly, but part of a broader early Bronze Age tradition across the Fertile Crescent. Death pits for the powerful were apparently just how things were done around 2500 BCE. The practice eventually died out, replaced by less lethal expressions of royal status. Somewhere along the line, society collectively decided that maybe elaborate gold grave goods were sufficient, without the added corpses. Progress is slow, but it happens. The logistics were frankly impressive. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Human sacrifice at civilizational scale required serious organizational capacity. You need supply chains for victims, training programs for priests, architectural infrastructure for ceremonies, and ideological systems to prevent everybody from collectively saying, "Wait, this is insane." The societies that practiced large-scale sacrifice weren't primitive. They were sophisticated enough to make mass killing systematically sustainable. The Aztec tribute system, for example, required conquered peoples to provide quotas of sacrificial victims alongside regular taxes. This was tracked and enforced. There were bureaucrats whose job was managing the human inventory. The Spanish found detailed records when they arrived. The Incas had administrators who selected Capacocha children based on specific criteria, coordinated their years-long preparation, and organized the logistics of moving them across an empire spanning thousands of miles. This required communication networks, supply depots, and interagency cooperation. Carthage maintained Tophets for centuries, suggesting institutional continuity and generational transmission of sacrificial practices. This wasn't a king's individual madness, it was cultural infrastructure. The Shang kept records carved into bone that we can still read today, documenting not just that sacrifices happened, but how many, when, and sometimes why. They were keeping receipts. For murder, when did everyone mostly stop? The transition away from human sacrifice happened differently everywhere, and stopped is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The Aztec practice ended when Spanish conquistadors showed up in 1519 and decided that human sacrifice was barbaric, which is rich coming from people who would go on to kill approximately 90% of the indigenous population through violence and disease. But, credit where due, they did stop the heart-ripping. Inca Capacocha effectively ended with Spanish conquest in 1533, though isolated practices may have continued in remote areas for decades afterward. The Shang dynasty collapsed around 1046 BCE, overthrown by the Zhou, who toned down human sacrifice significantly, though they didn't eliminate it entirely. Retainer sacrifice in China finally faded out over the following centuries. Carthage was literally wiped off the map by Rome in 146 BCE. The Romans, with their characteristic subtlety, razed the city, sold the surviving population into slavery, and allegedly salted the earth so nothing would grow. Whatever the Carthaginians were doing at their Tophets, they weren't doing it anymore. The royal tombs of represent practices from around 2600 to 2100 BCE. By the time of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, there's no evidence of mass retainer sacrifice in Mesopotamian royal burials. The practice simply faded, replaced by symbolic substitutes and smaller-scale offerings. Why this matters beyond the horror. Look, I know this entire script has been a parade of nightmares, but there's actually a point buried under all the skulls. Human sacrifice tells us something crucial about how societies organize belief, power, and violence. Every civilization that practiced it had elaborate theological justifications. The Aztecs genuinely believed the sun wouldn't rise without blood. The Incas genuinely believed they were sending children to paradise. The Carthaginians, the Shang, the Sumerians, they all had cosmologies that made killing people make sense. The priests weren't cackling villains. The rulers weren't mustache-twirling sadists. They were people operating within systems of meaning that made human sacrifice not just acceptable, but necessary, required, even, holy. And that's terrifying in a different way than the visceral horror of the acts themselves, because it means any society, given the right conditions and beliefs, can convince itself that killing people is the morally correct thing to do. We'd love to think we're fundamentally different from the priest holding the obsidian knife. We're not. We're the same species. We just got lucky with our cosmology. Anyway, subscribe for more content that will absolutely ruin your day. Next week, we're covering medieval dental practices, which somehow manages to be worse than everything I just described. Your teeth are going to hurt just from watching. And hey, at least now you have something to bring up at dinner parties when the conversation gets boring. Did you know the Aztecs had a skull rack with 136,000 heads? You'll never be invited back, but you'll certainly be memorable.